In the spring of 1940, at the height of World War II, the three small nations on the Baltic coast found themselves facing one of the most dangerous powers in the world. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania had fought for their independence just 2 decades earlier, yet in a matter of weeks, their hard-won freedom would vanish. These small republics were caught between the ambitions of two giants, Germany to the west under Adolf Hitler, and the Soviet Union to the east under Joseph Stalin. Both had expansionist visions, and both saw the Baltic region as strategically important. When the storm came, the Baltic countries found themselves almost powerless to resist. The question is, why did they not fight back when the Soviet Union marched in during the summer of 1940? To understand this, we must return to August of 1939. At that time, Europe was on the brink of war. Germany and the Soviet Union shocked the world by announcing that they had signed a non-aggression treaty. This was called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. On paper, it looked like a promise that the two ideologically opposed regimes would not attack one another. In reality, there were secret clauses hidden from the public. These protocols divided Eastern Europe into zones of influence. Germany and the Soviet Union agreed in advance which countries each would dominate once the war began. According to these arrangements, Estonia and Latvia were placed in the Soviet sphere. Lithuania at first was promised to Germany, but within weeks it too was traded to the Soviets in exchange for Polish territory. This deal effectively restored many of the old imperial ambitions of Russia. The Baltic states had once been provinces of the Tsarist Empire before the Russian Revolution of 1917, and now Stalin saw a chance to bring them back under Moscow's control. When war broke out in September 1939 and the Soviet Union invaded eastern Poland, Stalin immediately turned his attention to the Baltic. His first step was to pressure the governments of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania into signing what were called mutual assistance treaties. These were framed as protective agreements. In reality, they gave the Soviets the right to station thousands of troops on Baltic soil, along with airfields and naval bases. Within days, Red Army garrisons appeared across the region. They were strategically placed so that if Moscow chose to act, the Baltics could be seized almost instantly. But Stalin did not rely only on force. Soviet agents infiltrated political institutions and encouraged local communist groups. Newspapers, radio, and propaganda campaigns painted the existing governments as reactionary and pro-German. They claimed the Soviets were defenders of the working class and protectors against fascism.
This narrative prepared the ground for what was to come. The decisive moment arrived in June 1940. Europe was collapsing under the German onslaught.
France had just fallen. Britain was fighting for survival in the air. The United States remained neutral. For the Baltic states, there was no ally left to turn to. On June 14th, while German soldiers marched through Paris, the Soviet Union sent ultimatums to Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Each ultimatum demanded the formation of new governments approved by Moscow, the arrest of key political leaders, and the immediate entry of unlimited Soviet troops. The accusations justifying these demands were fabricated. The Soviets accused the Baltics of violating their treaties, of conspiring against Moscow, and of mistreating Red Army soldiers already stationed there. Behind these ultimatums stood overwhelming military power. The Soviet Union mobilized over 400,000 troops, backed by thousands of artillery pieces and tanks. By contrast, the Baltic armies were small, poorly armed, and lacked air support or armored forces. Even if they combined their strength, they could not hold out for more than a few days. Their governments faced a terrible choice: resist and see their cities destroyed along with countless civilian deaths, or submit and hope that surrender might preserve lives. With no outside support possible, the decision was made. They accepted the ultimatums. In the early morning of June 15th, Soviet troops crossed the Lithuanian border. Mechanized brigades with BT-7 and T-26 light tanks rolled across the countryside, followed by infantry divisions. They moved swiftly to occupy transportation hubs, junctions, and border towns. By the end of the day, all major Lithuanian cities' airfields and border defenses were in Soviet hands. The next day, ultimatums were sent to Latvia and Estonia. At dawn on June 17th, coordinated Soviet invasions began. In Latvia, Red Army forces advanced from the north and east, while naval infantry landed in the port of Liepāja. Soviet destroyers patrolled the Gulf of Riga, preventing any maritime escape. Armored brigades pushed rapidly toward Riga, the capital, ensuring that resistance would be impossible. In Estonia, Soviet columns advanced through Narva and other eastern roads, straight toward Tallinn. At the same time, the Baltic fleet landed Marines on the islands and in coastal harbors, while Soviet bombers and fighters took control of the skies. Within hours, Soviet flags flew over government buildings. What followed was not spontaneous uprising, but carefully staged theater. Pro-Soviet rallies were organized with workers parading through the streets carrying red banners. Newspapers printed editorials praising friendship with Moscow. Presidents and prime ministers were forced to resign and were replaced with new so-called people's governments chosen in Moscow. Elections were announced, but only one party was allowed to participate. Ballots offered no alternatives, and results were declared before voting ended, claiming nearly unanimous support. By early August, the process was complete. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia were formally annexed into the Soviet Union. The takeover from ultimatum to annexation had taken less than 2 months. But the story did not end there. After annexation, Soviet authorities moved quickly to cement their power. Private property was confiscated. Banks and industries were nationalized. Political parties were banned. The secret police spread into every town and city, recruiting informants and watching every move. Former government officials and army officers were arrested. Some were executed in secret, while others vanished into prisons and labor camps. By June 1941, the first wave of mass repression struck. In a single coordinated operation across all 3 Baltic states, around 75,000 people were deported. Families were awakened at night, given minutes to gather belongings, and forced onto trains. Men were often separated and sent to prison camps, while women, children, and the elderly were shipped to remote settlements in Siberia and Kazakhstan. Fear gripped the population. Then came another twist. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. German forces swept into the Baltics and were initially welcomed by some as liberators. For a brief moment, it seemed independence might return, but this was an illusion. German occupation was harsh and exploitative. The Baltics were not freed, but simply placed under another foreign power. By 1944, the Red Army returned, driving out the Germans and reimposing Soviet control. This time, the occupation was permanent. Still, not all Balts accepted Soviet rule. In forests and rural areas, partisan fighters known as the Forest Brothers waged guerrilla war. They carried out ambushes, attacked Soviet officials, and tried to keep the dream of independence alive. The Soviets responded with brutal counterinsurgency tactics, burning villages, deporting families, and infiltrating resistance groups with disguised units. By the early 1950s, organized armed resistance had been crushed. Once resistance faded, the process of Sovietization accelerated. Farms were merged into collective units. Private farming was banned. Industries and trade were fully controlled by the state. The Russian language was promoted in schools and administration, while local languages and national symbols were suppressed. History books were rewritten to portray the Soviet Union as a benevolent liberator. Religion was restricted, and churches were closed or monitored. Despite all this, the annexation was never recognized by many Western countries. Baltic diplomatic missions continued to operate in exile. Inside the Soviet Union, however, the events of 1940 could not be questioned. For the people of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the memory of their independence remained, but it was trapped under decades of occupation. Why then did the Baltic countries not resist in 1940? The answer is simple and tragic. They were isolated. Their armies were too small to stand against the Soviet juggernaut. Their allies in Europe had fallen or were fighting for survival. The United States stood aside. Their geography left them exposed with flat, open terrain that could be crossed in days. Stalin had prepared his takeover step by step, infiltrating politics, spreading propaganda, and surrounding them with troops. When the final blow fell, there was no realistic chance of success. The loss of independence in 1940 was not the result of cowardice, but of overwhelming force and ruthless planning. For the Baltic nations, survival meant endurance under occupation until the day came when freedom could return. That day would not arrive until the collapse of the Soviet Union half a century later.